Hello and welcome to this webinar entitled Contracts, Drafting Essentials, Exclusions, Endeavours and Termination with me, Keith Markham. As always, let's begin by having a look at the agenda for this session, which unsurprisingly comprises a discussion of exclusion and limitation clauses. We're going to look at one or two issues around the Unfair Contract Terms Act. We're also going to look particularly at issues to do with reasonableness and interpretation. And then once we've done that, we will move on to talk about endeavours clauses, so the usual sort of discussion around things like best endeavours, reasonable endeavours, all reasonable endeavours, and we'll look at the latest position with regard to that. And then finally, we will look at termination clauses, and we will talk about the kinds of issues that need to be covered in those clauses, some of the potential pitfalls, and some of the ways to deal with that in practice. So we've got a lot to talk about, so let's get started straight away then with the topic of exclusion and limitation clauses. And as I've said, we're going to look at three issues. A very brief overview of some of the provisions of the Unfair Contract Terms Act 1977. We will then go on to talk about particularly a reasonableness in that context, and we will look at a case study on that. And then we will look at two case studies around the issue of interpretation. It's certainly the case that most of the time the Unfair Contract Terms Act will apply, but not always. But the issue around interpretation will always be relevant, and we see this regularly referenced in case law. Therefore, when we're drafting these sorts of clauses, we need to make sure we are clear as to what the position is on that. So let's start with the Unfair Contract Terms Act. Again, a piece of legislation that hopefully most of you are familiar with. Again, the purpose of today is to not do a particularly deep dive on this. There are other sessions where we do that. But essentially, in a nutshell, let's remember that we're dealing with business-to-business contracts only, so no business to consumer. And in particular, this particular legislation contains rules about so-called exemption clauses, and in the main, it focuses on exclusions or restrictions of liability in any of the four following areas. So loss arising from negligence, loss arising from breach of contract, loss arising from a potential breach of the implied terms of the Sale of Goods Act, and finally, losses arising from misrepresentation. So those are the four main areas. Again, we're not going to go into the detail of that. So let's have a little bit of a look at an overview of what sorts of exclusions and restrictions of liability are permitted and indeed not permitted. Let's start with those which are not permitted. So again, this hopefully should be fairly familiar territory, but let's be clear. The Unfair Contract Terms Act, 1977, essentially prohibits the three types of exclusion and limitation clause that you see referred to at the top of the slide. So these three, which I'll just go through briefly in a moment, if they are found in the set of terms and conditions, effectively will be declared void by a court and therefore will be removed.